Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we're tackling this really interesting question you sent in. Can we actually learn from financial history enough to avoid future crises? To help answer that, we've got quite a bit to explore, most notably some excerpts from The Ascent of Money by Niall Ferguson.
Yeah, Ferguson takes us on a wild ride, from ancient Mesopotamia all the way to, well, modern day Wall Street. But I think what's important to remember is that his main argument is that finance, it's actually the backbone of human progress, that really sets the stage for examining the patterns of, well, booms and busts that we see.
Right, and to help with that, we've got some pretty compelling historical example to go over. We're going to be looking at stories of, well, Spanish conquistadors, the Medici dynasty, and even John Law's infamous Mississippi bubble.
Oh, yeah. Talk about a recipe for financial disaster.
Yeah.
But really, each of these stories, they illuminate a different part of financial history. And what's really fascinating is that Ferguson uses them to highlight human psychology, innovation, and obviously the constant struggle between risk and regulation.
Okay, so let's start with those conquistadors. It's easy to think of them as just these ruthless adventurers driven only by greed. But Ferguson suggests that their obsession with gold, it actually stemmed from a deeper misunderstanding of what money actually represents.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. They hauled literal tons of gold and silver back to Spain. They thought they were making Spain wealthy, but they didn't get the fact that money is essentially a promise. It's a representation of value, a way to exchange goods and services. And what's ironic is they ended up triggering massive inflation, which basically just erased the purchasing power of all that newfound wealth.
Yeah, it's a classic example of how more money, it doesn't necessarily mean more prosperity. It all boils down to trust and confidence in the system.
Exactly. And to see that, take ancient Mesopotamia. Ferguson talks about those clay tablets used to track transactions and debts. Those tablets, well, they show that credit and lending, they were already pretty complex concepts, even thousands of years ago. So the foundation of finance, this idea of promises and obligations, it's been there forever, deeply rooted in human history.
So we've got, like, ancient clay tablets representing debt on one end, and then on the other end, complex modern things like credit default swaps. It's kind of incredible how much financial systems have evolved, yet those basic principles like managing risk and facilitating trade, those seem to remain constant.
Yeah, and within that evolution, human behavior, well, it's always playing a part. Remember the Mississippi bubble we mentioned before? Yeah, it's like a big warning sign showing that even with something that seems like a really innovative financial instrument, human psychology, especially that irrational exuberance, it can completely derail everything.
Right. John Law, with his whole idea of printing paper money backed by the supposed riches of the Mississippi Valley, it's amazing how he convinced so many people to buy into that vision, driving the price of those Mississippi Company shares, well, way too high.
It was a classic speculative bubble, completely fueled by hype. And when investors finally realized that the company's assets, they were nowhere near as valuable as advertised, the bubble burst and it led to financial chaos everywhere. And this pattern, it shows up again and again throughout history, doesn't it? Like, look at the Dutch tulip mania, the South Sea bubble, the dot-com crash. They all have that same thread running through them.
Yeah, all those booms and busts really seem to suggest that history does tend to repeat itself. It really emphasizes Ferguson's point about the cyclical nature of financial history. And maybe, if we can recognize those patterns, we can all become more discerning investors, better at assessing risk, and, avoid getting caught up in the frenzy.
I think the key here is really the interplay between, these ever-evolving financial systems and the fact that human behavior, it basically stays the same. It's this back and forth, this push and pull that ends up shaping, well, the whole financial landscape.
Okay, so we've got speculative bubbles and all the dangers of getting carried away. But what about the flip side? Are there examples in history where financial innovation actually brought about positive social change?
Absolutely. And for that, we don't need to look any further than the Medici family. They're a great example of how financial innovation can really drive cultural and societal transformation.
Right, they started out as just merchants and bankers, but then they rose to become these huge patrons of the arts. And Ferguson actually connects their innovative financial practices, especially their new accounting methods, directly to the flourishing of the Renaissance.
Exactly. The Medici's double-entry bookkeeping, it allowed for more complex and ambitious projects, which directly led to all those amazing artistic and architectural masterpieces of the Renaissance. They weren't just hoarding wealth, they were using it strategically to shape the world around them.
So they were essentially using finance as a tool to promote cultural growth, which is a fascinating idea. But of course, this also brings up questions about the influence of wealth and, the potential for exploitation.
Right. The Medici story also shows how close finance and power really are. Throughout history, whoever controls the flow of money, well, they often hold a lot of influence over not just economies, but politics and society too.
And this leads us to the rise of modern banking in places like the Bank of England. It started out as this private entity managing government debt, but it gradually changed into the central bank we know today, the one responsible for maintaining financial stability.
It's a fascinating example of how financial institutions adapt to, changing times. And that role, managing financial stability, it continues to evolve, especially in response to things like, well, the 1929 stock market crash or even the more recent subprime mortgage crisis.
Crises that Ferguson uses to really highlight the dangers of excessive leverage and the need for effective regulation. But even with those lessons learned, each new crisis seems to reveal vulnerabilities in the system that nobody saw coming.
You're right. Take the subprime crisis. It showed just how interconnected and complex the whole global financial system had become. And it also highlighted how the lack of transparency, especially in the market for mortgage-backed securities, well, it played a big role in the crisis unfolding.
It seems like a constant game of catch-up. As financial systems get more sophisticated, new risks pop up, demanding new and innovative types of oversight and regulation. But how do we find that balance between, mitigating risk and stifling innovation?
Ugh, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Too much regulation can hold back growth, but too little can lead to reckless behavior and instability. Finding that perfect spot, that's what's crucial.
Yeah. And that's where understanding financial history is so important. By recognizing those patterns from the past, maybe, just maybe, we could avoid repeating the same mistakes over and over again. But as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, there are some challenges that seem to exist no matter the time or the circumstances.
Definitely. The human element, with all its quirks and contradictions, it keeps shaping the financial landscape, often in ways we could never predict. But we'll save that discussion for our next session.
Okay, so we've talked about how financial history, well, is full of these booms and busts,
hmm
often driven by how people think and that desire for quick wealth. But what about those mechanisms we've put in place to try and soften those risks? Like, what about insurance? I'm curious how Ferguson approaches this whole idea of managing uncertainty.
Well, insurance is a really interesting example of how societies, well, they've tried to kind of control risk. Ferguson traces it all the way back to, ancient maritime trade. Those merchants, they knew how dangerous the sea was, so they would pool their resources to protect themselves if a ship was lost in a storm or, attacked by pirates.
Right, that makes sense. It's like a shared safety net, right?
Right, yeah.
Everyone shares the burden if one ship goes down. But how did that early idea turn into the massive insurance industry we see today?
It was a slow process, really, driven by both innovation and necessity. As societies got more complex, well, so did the types of risks they had to deal with. So we see fire insurance popping up in the 17th century, life insurance in the 18th, and so on. Each new kind of insurance, it reflected a growing understanding of those specific vulnerabilities and a desire to, mitigate those risks.
And I'm guessing the development of, what's it called, actuarial science, using statistics and probability to figure out risk. That probably played a big part in shaping the industry, right?
Oh, absolutely. Actuarial science, it gave a framework for actually quantifying risk, allowing insurers to, set premiums based on data and analysis rather than just intuition. It was a crucial step in turning insurance from the social agreement into, well,
hmm
a sophisticated financial system.
Okay, so we've got these risk management techniques evolving. But even with insurance, we all know things can still go wrong. You mentioned a story about Hurricane Katrina that really drives this point home.
Ah, yeah, Katrina. A terrible event that really exposed the limits of even the best intentioned insurance systems. The problem wasn't so much the lack of coverage, but more the ambiguities in the policies themselves. Was the damage from wind? Or was it flooding? Who was actually on the hook for the losses? These questions, well, they led to these long legal battles and, well, just made things worse for people who had already lost so much.
It's a tough reminder that even with insurance, there's always that element of risk. The risk that, that the coverage might not be what you thought it was, or that the insurer might not, might not keep their promise.
It really shows how important it is to not just have insurance, but to really understand what your policy actually says and know what your rights are as a policyholder.
That's a good point. And it seems like this whole issue of risk and responsibility, it's even more important today as we face things like climate change, cyber attacks, and, well, all these other new threats.
Absolutely. The insurance industry, it's constantly evolving, trying to stay ahead of those emerging risks and manage them. It's a dynamic process, always balancing innovation with regulation and, well, just responding to the ever-changing landscape of global events.
And speaking of these big forces that shape financial systems, Ferguson also gets into how governments started providing social safety nets. It's interesting to see how this idea of a welfare state developed and how it's being challenged today.
The welfare state, with its promise of social insurance for things like unemployment, illness, and getting older, it was a big part of many 20th century societies. But as we're seeing now, these systems are, well, they're under a lot of pressure because of things like aging populations, healthcare costs going up, and in growing economic inequality.
It makes you wonder how we can adapt these systems to the 21st century.
Hmm.
Can we find a sustainable balance between what individuals are responsible for and and what kind of collective support we provide
Hmm.
between market-driven solutions and government involvement?
It's a tough issue with no easy answers. But, like Ferguson suggests, if we understand the historical context of social insurance, how it came about from specific needs and challenges, it might give us some valuable insight into, these debates we're having now.
So it's this constant interplay between, what individuals do, what policies governments put in place, and these financial systems that are always evolving and underpinning our lives. It's a complicated web, but it seems like, well, understanding those connections is crucial for navigating the future.
Exactly. And there's no better example of that interplay than the rise of the modern corporation. From those small family businesses to these multinational giants, the corporation, well, it's completely changed the global economic landscape.
It's a story of innovation, ambition, and of course, making a profit. But how did this huge transformation happen? How do we go from individual merchants to these massive entities with so much power?
Well, Ferguson takes us back to those early joint stock companies. The concept of limited liability, that was a real game changer. This idea that, well, an investor's losses would only be as much as their initial investment, it encouraged people to take more risks, and that fueled economic growth and innovation.
It's kind of like the early days of crowdfunding, but, way bigger. And if it makes sense, if you're not risking everything you have, you're more likely to invest in new things, right?
Exactly, and this idea of spreading both risk and reward, something we see again and again in financial history, it was essential for corporations to grow. But as we know, with great power comes great responsibility. And, well, the history of corporations is also a history of people abusing that power, of monopolies, and, well, putting profit ahead of doing the right thing.
It's that double-edged sword we've been talking about. Financial innovation can drive progress, but it can also create opportunities for people to be exploited and, well, for things to get reckless.
Exactly. And the story of the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, is a perfect example. This huge trading company, they dominated the spice trade in the 17th century, making a ton of money for their investors.
I remember reading about the VOC. They had their own army and a navy. They were practically a country within a country. But what took them down? Did they just overreach, try to expand too fast?
There was some of that, sure, but the real problem was that their corporate governance failed. The VOC's directors, well, they got more interested in lining their own pockets than in looking out for the company's long-term interests and, their shareholders. They got involved in risky speculation, which put the company deep in debt.
So it's a classic story of greed and corruption, and in the end, it led to their downfall. But it also highlights how important transparency and accountability are in corporate structures.
Absolutely. The VOC going under, well, it underscores the need for strong regulations and ethical leaders to make sure that corporate power is being used for the right reasons. And that lesson, it still resonates today as we deal with things like corporate social responsibility and the influence of these big multinational corporations on the world stage.
It seems like every era has its own version of the VOC, those companies that rise to the top but eventually fall apart because of internal problems or external pressures.
And it's up to us, as investors, consumers, and just citizens to hold these institutions accountable, to demand transparency, and to push for an economic system that's fairer and more sustainable.
We've covered a lot today. We've seen how risk management strategies changed, how governments grappled with providing social safety nets, and how the corporation became this dominant force. But that big question is still out there. Can we actually break free from the cyclical patterns of financial history? Or are we destined to keep making the same mistakes?
Ah, that's the question, isn't it? And while there aren't any easy answers, I think Ferguson offers some interesting insights into how we might approach this whole challenge.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but maybe we should save that for the last part of our deep dive. That way we can really get into the implications of everything we've talked about.
Sounds good. Let's take a minute to gather our thoughts and get ready for the final stage of our journey. I have a feeling what we find out will be important not just for understanding financial history, but for, figuring out our own financial lives too.
Okay, so we've explored, centuries of financial history. We've seen those patterns of booms and busts. We've talked about how risk management's changed and the rise of these big, powerful institutions like central banks and corporations. But I kind of want to shift gears now and talk about something, well, something that's especially relevant to you, and that's microfinance and how it can empower people, especially in developing countries.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating example of how you can use financial innovation to actually tackle social problems. At its heart, microfinance is about giving small loans and other financial services to folks who are usually shut out of traditional banking.
Right, so we're talking about people who maybe don't have collateral or a credit history. People who, well, conventional lenders often see as too risky. But those microfinance institutions, those MFIs, they found ways to, to figure out the risk and make credit available to these folks who are underserved.
Exactly. And one of the really amazing things about microfinance is that it focuses on empowering women.
Hmm.
Take the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, for instance. It was founded by Hamid Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize. They saw how women in developing countries often face these huge barriers to accessing financial services, but they're incredibly resourceful and responsible borrowers.
It's more than just giving them loans. It's about giving them opportunities. By giving women access to financial resources, microfinance helps them, start businesses, support their families, and become active participants in the economy.
Yeah, it's a powerful example of how you can use finance as a tool for social change, for creating a world that's more equitable and inclusive.
So we've got these like global forces shaping financial systems at a huge scale, but then we've also got these like grassroots movements like microfinance that are empowering individuals and communities from the ground up. It's amazing to see how these different forces interact and influence one another.
It really highlights how dynamic finance is, how it works at both those macro and micro levels, impacting everything from, global trade down to the lives of individuals in small villages.
It's been quite a journey through all of financial history. We've seen empires come and go, bubbles expand and burst, and innovation completely reshape the world. But if you had to pick one key takeaway from all this, what would it be?
For me, it's that finance really boils down to human behavior, our hopes, our fears, and, well, sometimes our completely irrational exuberance. It's not just numbers on a page. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about the future, the promises we make, and, well, the risks we're willing to take.
Absolutely. And as we've seen, those stories, can lead to incredible innovations, but also those spectacular crashes. It seems like the challenge is to, harness that human creativity while also learning from all those past mistakes.
Exactly. And that brings us back to your question at the beginning. Can we actually learn enough from financial history to, prevent future crises? While we may never be able to completely eliminate risk, I do believe that if we understand those patterns from the past, recognize our own biases and promote transparency and accountability, we can create a more resilient and, well, a more equitable financial system.
It's a challenge that needs both individual and collective action. We all have a part to play in shaping the future of finance, from the choices we make as investors and consumers to the policies we support as citizens.
And that's maybe the most important takeaway from our deep dive into financial history, that we're not just passively watching these systems, we're actively shaping them with every decision we make.
That's something to think about. We hope exploring all this has sparked your curiosity and given you some new ways to look at the world of finance. Remember, history might not repeat itself exactly, but it often rhymes. If we can understand those rhymes, those repeating patterns of human behavior and financial innovation, we can all better navigate the complexities of our own financial lives. And we can help build a future that's more stable and more prosperous. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.